Thank you, Alan. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a delight to be here. I bring conservative greetings from liberal Massachusetts. There's even good news from the Bay State. As a result of the last census, it was determined that Massachusetts shall have one less congressman. And that's good news. Now, if we could only arrange for one less senator. One of Senator Kennedy's adoring aides recently told him that one of his proposals would surely earn the votes of all the thinking people. In a moment of rare candor, Kennedy replied, "That's not enough. We rely on those who don't think." We are indeed surrounded by liberals and worse, and you have your share elsewhere. To be sure, Massachusetts has no monopoly on that. The liberal showed up at work not too long ago with both ears bandaged. One of his co-workers said, "Why? What happened to you? My golly." Well, he said, "I was watching a football game on television, and my wife was ironing nearby, and she went to the kitchen for something, and the phone rang. I reached for it, but I grabbed the iron instead." Well, the fellow thought for a second. He says, "What about your other ear?" He says, "Just my luck, the guy called right back." How many of you remember where you were 25 years ago when the John Birch Society was founded? As you've heard, I was on my way home to the United States, a Marine lieutenant at the time who had spent several months in duty after an amphibious landing in Beirut, Lebanon. I didn't know about the John Birch Society, of course. I didn't know Robert Welch. I didn't know what he was starting. And there's a great deal going to be said today about the years after 1958, but I want to take a few minutes to discuss the history which led to our society's beginning. And we start by noting that Robert Welch was born on December 1st of 1899. He's 1 month older than the 20th century. And he's often noted that therefore it should listen to him. He was educated at home at a small country school, recognized early as a prodigy. Family started to teach him read when he was 2, taught him Latin and Greek when he was 5. He read a 9-volume history of the world when he was 7. He went to and graduated from the University of North Carolina at age 16. Went on to the Naval Academy, had an exemplary record. Left after 2 years, went up to Massachusetts. The reason he went to Massachusetts is that he wanted to become a lawyer, and he was told that if he was going to be a lawyer, he should go to the finest law school in the United States, Harvard University. He went. He found out about Harvard University. During his 3rd year, he tangled with Felix Frankfurter, and he got so intensely disgusted with what Felix Frankfurter was teaching even then in the early 1920s that he walked out of Harvard Law School in disgust, and he never returned. At that point, he started a business. He wanted to produce something, and so he decided to manufacture something that would be a consumable. People would buy one and buy another and tell their friends, and they'd buy some more. Not something that you would buy and have for a lifetime. His little survey turned up candy. He started producing candy. Then he teamed up with his brother, James O. Welch. They formed the James O. Welch Sugar Daddy Candy Company. Robert Welch invented the Sugar Daddy. Now, I know a lot of you realize that, but I want all of you to realize it because someday you might win $1 million on a quiz show. But of course, Robert Welch retained his love of history and his study of the nation's affairs. He became concerned increasingly as the Roosevelt administration began to pile up all kinds of government agencies. The very year I was born, 1935, he wrote an essay called "A Weight on My Shoulders." And in that essay, you get a measure of the man, Robert Welch. He said this: "The glory that is passing in America that I was born in, that was given to me by courageous and far-seeing men, many of whom died for that purpose. that I grew up in, went to school in, and loved more every year as I came to understand what a miraculous achievement it was as compared with any other social group at any place or any time in this history of the world. My America is being made over into a carbon copy of thousands of despotisms that have gone before. He said that in 1935. So you can see he was concerned. Well, the concern continued. So much so that a few years later he decided that he better take pen to hand and see if he couldn't stop this plunge into socialism. He decided to write a book about the Roosevelt administration, and he called it The Ant Colony. You can imagine the weapon of satire through the pen of Robert Welch. He hired a young man to help him with the book, the manuscript, the sending of the early chapters of it to some publishers who were immediately interested and wanted it very much, and it looked like it was going to be quite a productive thing and also possibly something that might even make a little money. He was at home one Sunday afternoon and a telephone rang. It was his young friend, and the young friend said, "Mr. Welch, I guess we have to scrap the book." And Mr. Welch said, "Why? What do you mean, why?" Well, he said, "Oh," he says, you haven't been listening to your radio. You don't know that the Japanese have just bombed Pearl Harbor. We're at war, and we certainly can't publish a book criticizing the president while our nation is at war." How true. And so The Ant Colony was never published. It's one of several manuscripts that are available, and someday we will publish all of what Robert Welch has written, and there will certainly be many more takers for it than we already have. World War II ended, of course. Back in those days, we had a Department of War, and so we won. Now we have a Department of Defense, and we don't win. But after the war was over, his concerns continued because the mechanisms of the socialist takeover of our country were not being dismantled. He decided to study socialism. He went to England in 1946, 47 to study socialism, and that's when he discovered a conspiracy. He came back to America and he found these same British socialist organizations putting their organizations together here in the United States. You can imagine how his concerns mounted. He eventually tried to get involved in politics himself. He ran for lieutenant governor of Massachusetts in 1950, tried to get the Republican nomination, did not succeed, failed in the purely political, and he also noted that many of the people throughout the state of Massachusetts did not understand what he was talking about when he tried to impress upon them the need to keep our country free of socialism, the need to go back to the roots and go back to the foundations, this wonderful nation that we had. So he became even more concerned. He, of course, got involved in the purely political again in 1952, trying to get Robert Taft nominated as the Republican candidate for president, defeated again when the Eastern establishment Republicans, the Council on Foreign Relations types, dragged an old Democrat out of mothballs named Eisenhower and stole the nomination from Taft. So Robert Welch was tremendously frustrated with the purely political. It was about the same time, of course, that he took pen to hand and he wrote a book. It was originally a speech called Atchison and MacArthur, but it was so well received and it was so explosive at the time that he finally wrote it in book form. And that book, of course, is May God Forgive Us. And here's one of the early editions of that. May God forgive us for forcing China to go communist, for losing the Korean War, and for firing General MacArthur. The book sold a couple of 100,000 copies, and a lot of people contacted the publisher or contacted the author directly and said, "This is tremendous, this is what we need, please keep doing this." Well, Robert Welch was still the vice president in charge of sales and advertising of a large nationwide candy concern. But he did what he could. 1954, he came out with this other book, The Life of John Birch. I don't have to dwell on who John Birch was before this audience. And that book, too, sold a couple of 100,000 copies, and a lot of people got back to him and said, again, please help us, do what you can. And so he decided in 1956 to start a little magazine. He wrote the whole thing himself, called it One Man's Opinion. It was an occasional publication. He would ask people to subscribe, and he'd say, if you subscribe for 5 issues, he said, you'll get them, but I'm not going to tell you when. If it's 10, you'll get the 10. Well, that began to kind of take off in publication jargon. In 1958, he changed the name of it when he got others to help him to American Opinion, and there's the first issue of that in 1958. That actually, of course, predates the John Birch Society by almost a year. And it was in the September issue of 1958 in American Opinion that Robert Welch laid it out about Castro before he took control of Cuba. And so Robert Welch, increasingly concerned. He'd been involved with Senator Joseph McCarthy and had spoken with him on several programs, had tried to alert America about what was happening to our country, about the fact of a conspiracy. I heard him tell a delightful story about himself one time when he went to Maine to speak at a McCarthy rally. Now, if anybody here has been in Maine, you know that those people up there are fairly closed-mouthed. Try to get them in conversation is like pulling teeth. But Robert Welch went up there, and he was especially anxious to get something going here in Maine, and delighted that they would invite him up from Boston to give this speech. And there was a good audience, and it was a dinner meeting. But he pushed his food around on his plate and everything else, and he just didn't want to eat too much. The MC of the program, his host, looked at him and said, "Aren't you going to eat your supper?" And he said, well, no, it's a very fine supper. I'm very anxious to, but he said, I just don't like to eat a lot before I speak because I want to do a good job tonight, and I hope you understand. Oh, he said, oh, sure. So he didn't really eat much. Time came for his speech. He got up and he gave it everything he had. He was quite pleased himself at the end of it. And there was very, very generous applause, and he acknowledged it. The MC got back up to the microphone, looked down at him and said, "You could have ate." There's one aspect of Robert Welch that has always delighted me, and that's his humor. I love him for it. I've seen him many times at very tough meetings when he's talking strategy and asking us for our opinion or chewing us out for blowing something, and right in the middle of it, he'd always remember a funny story, some of them better than others. But I always said to myself, that's something that keeps this man going, a sense of humor. And so it did. Now, during 1957 and 58, he took trips to different parts of the world to visit with anti-communist leaders that he'd come in contact with. He went and visited Chiang Kai-shek. He went and visited the grand old man of Germany, Der Alte, Konrad Adenauer. He visited several others to tell them what he was about to plan, asked for their advice. Many of them gave him good advice, Adenauer especially. And late in 1958, he sat down and he wrote the notes for a founding meeting of an organization. He invited 15 of his friends to meet with him in Indianapolis. Why Indianapolis? Well, it was centrally located for the people who had been invited to the meeting. And he contacted a woman who was a friend of his, a woman he'd never met, but he knew her through correspondence. And he asked her if she would recommend a place to hold the meeting that he was describing. And she wrote back quickly, and she said, I can think of no better place to hold it than my own home. She said, you'll be perfectly private. We'll serve lunch for you. We'll have sandwiches and coffee breaks if you'd like it. And he took her up on it, and that's why the John Birch Society was held at that home on Washington Boulevard here, the home of Paul and Mary Bender, who are here today, and who've told me that if you'd like, you could come by. Now, at that meeting, of course, he spoke to them for 2 full days. Only 11 came of the 15 he invited, and he didn't tell them what it was about. He just said it was something very important, and he asked them if they'd come to please stay for 2 days because it was so important. So they came, and they listened. And at the end of the 2-day, 17 hours, a man named Ben McMillan reached across with a check and handed it to him and said, Bob, I guess we're in business. And the John Birch Society was born. And then Robert Welch, of course, took that 2-day seminar on the road, and all the early members of the John Birch Society came into our organization as a result of listening to Robert Welch speak for 2 full days. Then they finally convinced them to pare it down to 1. And then they put part of it on film, and of course the Blue Book had been written, and then the Society started hiring staff, and we went up the line. Now, one thing that happened is quite interesting, I think, and that is that Marguerite Dice, who was the hostess, of course, of that meeting, sat on a camp chair right outside her own living room during the whole meeting, listened to every word. Who wouldn't? And after it was over and the men had gone home, Mr. Welsh stayed about to thank her and to, I guess he probably took her out to lunch or dinner or something, and she got a chance to tell him what she thought. She said, "Mr. Welsh, that was fantastic. That was superb." She said, "I can't tell you how impressed I am with the depth, the philosophical background, the historical research, everything that you've put into it. It was magnificent," she said. "But it won't work." And he looked at her. She said, "The American people will never sit still for that amount of thoroughness." And she pulled out of her purse a sheet of paper that looked something like this. Not exactly this. And as you can see, it's printed from pillar to post and from stem to stern. It's underlined. There are marginal notes. You take a look at it, and it hurts your eyes. She said, "This is what is needed. This is what the American people will sit still for." He gulped. He said, "Thank you very much. I'll certainly keep your idea in mind, but I think I'll give mine a whirl." Robert Welsh has been absolutely death on a one-sheet flyer for so many years. We snuck one in on him, however, when we started the Birch Log, and he's even grown to like that a little bit. But the thoroughness, the depth, the background, the quality of the printing, the everything first class about the John Birch Society is because Robert Welsh demanded it. And thank God he did. That has made such a difference. It was about 10 years later, Robert Welsh got a letter from Marguerite Dice with an application blank for membership and a check for a year's dues, and a little note said, "I guess you were right. Do you still have room for me?" And so the John Birch Society was born. Now, I brought you up to when it was born. There's certainly so much that's going to be said today about after that point. But we're here today because of that one man. I consider you all friends. I hope you consider me the same. We're part of something that has already earned a page in history, and whether or not it will be a chapter is up to us. So for all of you who are members of the John Birch Society, you have my deep thanks, my respect. Keep at it, and let's turn this world gone crazy back to sanity again. Thank you.